right. Well, here we are again. It's still the 9th of April, 2021. I'm trying to give you a little different view while you listen to the story. This is the Jordan River, not the one in Israel that goes between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. This is the Jordan River that goes between the Utah Lake and the Great Salt Lake. But I did use it as the River Jordan in my movie, so I thought it was probably a good idea to come here and just let you look at this for a bit. You might even hear, even though I have this little mic screen on here that keeps too much excess noise away, you might hear the birds and the ducks as we're talking. Okay, so we're here to do chapter 8. So here we go, and I won't be in the frame for very long. Okay, here we are. Chapter 8. Yochanan had been in the palace prison at Tiberias for some time. He knew not how long. However, to his surprise, Herod Antipas was actually treating him quite well. He received 3 meals every day, several walks while under guard, and he could study and meditate as he desired, particularly on the Sabbaths. He could hear the crowds at the gate demanding his release, but the palace was now well fortified with a number of Herod's guards and a Roman sentry. Zealots had made several attempts to gain entry to the palace, but all had been discovered by the guards and killed. Yochanan heard of those brave patriots and was overcome with grief that they were sacrificing themselves, trying to free him. He feared that Joseph or Jude might attempt a grand assault. He knew it would be fruitless. Even if the resistance gained entry to the palace, the guards would kill him before any rescue was accomplished. He decided on another strategy. Herod permitted Yochanan to have 2 visitors twice a week. These could be anyone of his naming, and they were permitted to stay with him for 1 hour. Yochanan had not seen Jude, Jacob, or Joseph. That was as it should be. They were too important to have their identities clearly made to the enemy. Instead, the visitors Yochanan received would always deliver his messages via code that the guards attending him could not understand. Herod was aware of this possibility, but felt secure in the plan to allow the people to know Yochanan was alive and well. He was sure they understood that any attempts to free the immerser would mean death for them and certain death for Yochanan. Over the course of time, Yochanan learned of Jude's capture and the wound he received. He also learned that Joseph had rescued him and that Jude had returned to Damascus to fully recover. It also came to his attention that Joseph had used Samaritans as allies, which was rather bizarre given the animosity most Jews, especially those of Damascus, held for them. But it was a perfectly understandable strategic move. It was obvious from the news that Jude was not happy about this step of Joseph to increase his support. More importantly for Yochanan, however, were Joseph's efforts to initiate his own followers outside the way of Damascus. Apparently, Joseph was preparing a group under an organization independent of Damascus, yet still recognizing the high priestly role of Yochanan and using the same or similar ordinances and rituals. Yochanan knew where Joseph had learned to do this, On, in Egypt. For Jude, these activities by Joseph above and beyond the resistance efforts had been the final straw to break his relationship with him. The proof of his insolence, in Jude's view, was Joseph's presumption to act as a kind of priest and king. Jude believed that Joseph's conduct was not according to Torah. He considered On as merely a repository for the pagan and materialistic indulgences of the Goyim and the refuge for Jews who had no interest in Jerusalem's true destiny. Had not Ezekiel warned the aristocracy not to use Egyptian mystical symbols but to create ones appropriate for Israel? Had not the community, Emmaus and Yochanan, accomplished this, having received from them from the fathers on back to Yeshua ben Yehozadak at the time of the return of the captivity? Of course they had. Other than recognizing Joseph as an ally and coordinating operations with him, Jude considered him and his disciples dead to him and the community. This was simply a euphemism for them not being a part of the true way of Damascus. But Yochanan understood just what Joseph had received in On. Yes, Yochanan was the high priest from Aaron, the brother of Moses. That priesthood was about 1,300 years old and had passed down through the generations from father to son, and now resided in Yochanan. But Joseph received an initiation into the mysteries, a priesthood or order beyond the scope of Aaron and Levi. It was an order that existed even prior to Abraham. In fact, that priesthood and its rituals had existed at least 1,000 years before Abraham. Abraham had received them from the patriarchs of mankind. Joseph knew these mysteries could, with practice, dedication, and study, bring him, his followers, Israel, and all he hoped, all of mankind, to the presence of the throne of glory and complete the reconciliation of the individual's relationship with the Creator. But that would have to remain a mystery, for none of this would change the Torah. Indeed, Torah contained the secret code for the attainment of this order. Hidden behind the story and embedded in its very alphabet was the mystery of mankind's true origin and the method to obtain that knowledge. On had shared that knowledge with Joseph, and now, as Yochanan understood it, Jacob had accepted Joseph's teachings. It was well for him to have done so, and Yochanan was sure his own earthly mission was now nearly complete. However, the further rift Yochanan had feared when he talked with Joseph on the bank of the Jordan was a reality that troubled him. Yet Joseph was doing what appeared right to Yochanan. He was doing as he had been trained and inspired. He was certainly acting like a king, and a righteous one at that. But Yochanan wanted to be sure. During one of his weekly visits, where he had requested the presence of members of Joseph's organization, Yochanan asked them to deliver a message. The message was a question. Was Joseph going to fully claim the throne and deliver Israel, or was he going to allow his brother Jude or someone else altogether to lay their own claim? Once he received Yochanan's request, Joseph had the return message delivered from his alias of Yeshua, sending the same two visitors only a week later. Yochanan listened to their words. The Rabbi Yeshua says to tell you that the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor receive the message. He has ascended to Ezekiel's vision. The Zedek is with him. Also, our rabbi sends word that of all them born of woman, there is none greater than you. You have fulfilled your station. Joseph had replied in the common code of the way. The blind receiving their sight represented his teachings to his order about the converts to his organization. The lame walking meant that the followers were given the code so they could understand for themselves and carry out their duties. The leper being cleansed was a code to describe those who had fallen from their vows but returned to the cause. The deaf hearing meant that they who had ignored the call were now responding. The dead being raised was a code that those outside of the way or removed by Damascus for their loyalty to Joseph were now being brought into Joseph's organization and their rights restored. The poor being taught the message simply was code for the top leaders of Joseph's organization receiving the sacred tokens of the royal court. The words pertaining to Ezekiel's vision meant that he was approaching the ultimate of truth and enlightenment, of the Hekkelot, and was seeking to become an adopted son of Hashem. In short, Joseph's organization to restore the kingdom of Israel to its rightful place was serving its purpose. And most importantly, Jacob supported Joseph. Yochanan was satisfied that his mission to find the rightful king and prepare a people for him was accomplished. The extremes of Damascus were not for the king of Israel, nor those who had gained knowledge of the tree of life through righteousness and Hekkelot. Joseph had arrived where Torah was to take him. That was all that mattered. Caiaphas was walking about the temple grounds after performing his daily duties. His thoughts were not upon Hashem, however. His mind was contemplating the state of affairs in Judea, indeed all Palestine, and the difficulties he may face if Herod and Pilate could not get a handle on defeating the resistance. His obsession with Yochanan continued to seethe inside of him, causing a state of perpetual anxiety from which he could not extricate himself. As he struggled with this mental and emotional turmoil, he looked south past the court of the Gentiles and thought he saw a man similar to Yochanan teaching just outside the temple. But this man was wearing white linen, something Caiaphas had never seen Yochanan do, even though he had heard of the possibility. Having only seen him from a distance, Caiaphas thought it was Yochanan somehow again released from Herod, as no other reliable information seemed available to explain what was happening. He wanted to go check for himself, but the crowds around Yochanan were always antagonistic to him, even dangerous. His anger rose so fast that an inexplicable pressure brought pain to his head and behind his eyes. He immediately called for his guards to arrest the man. All can approach Hashem, Jacob said to the people who were gathering about him. In Hashem's house are many chambers that are not in the walls of the temple. We must approach Hashem in these chambers and not leave the works of the temple undone. What do you mean, Rabbi? One of the men in the crowd asked. How can we worship Hashem without the temple? Every man is a temple of Hashem, my friend. Jacob leaned toward him and then toward the crowd. We, as Abraham's seed and the inheritors of deliverance from Egypt, are required to perform the ordinance of the temple individually and as a people. But what Hashem desires most is for each one of us to approach him through the chambers of our hearts and minds, reaching to him with our spirits. Pray always in the name of mine, in the name of Hashem, and whatever you ask, he shall give it to you. You mean we do not need to bring sacrifices to the temple anymore? Asked another. What about circumcision? Asked a man who had a little boy in his arms. It is a law to us, he said. By all means, we must continue to honor the ordinances of the temple and the Torah, Jacob explained. Do that as required, but do not leave it merely to the priests to accomplish a change in your hearts. Seek Hashem in the secret chambers of your mind and heart, calling upon his name with every breath. In Hashem are many mansions, chambers where we may dwell and where Hashem will come near to us. But we must climb the ladders to the chambers as we increase in understanding and piety. Jacob paused to look around him. He looked into the eyes of almost every person there, men, women, and children. He could see that they were perplexed. They did not understand he was talking about more than a mere prayer. He was trying to uplift their consciousness of themselves, each other, and Hashem. Indeed, Jacob now understood that the purpose of Hashem through Torah was to raise the souls and consciousness of the people. But they were not all prepared for his message. It was still a time of growth, even for those who had been exposed to the mysteries. He realized why Yosef had been careful with these things and how he approached the people at large with much simpler words before he brought them into his circle. While Jacob had decided to go to Jerusalem and teach the way he had seen Yochanan do, he realized he had gone too far, too fast. He decided to return to Damascus and discuss these things more in depth with those who already had some initiation into his meaning. To them who have eyes to see and ears to hear, I give this message with my lips, he said. If any want more, let him ask me. What about the chief priests? Why must we do as they tell us? Another asked. And even Caesar and Herod, a voice cried from the back of the group, and yet Jacob could not see the face of the man that asked the question. Was it a trap? The chief priests sit in Moses' seat. Therefore do what they tell you to do, but do not do as they do. Do as Moses taught. Be more righteous than they are, and more righteous than Herod, Jacob carefully said. He then turned to leave and noticed the high priest's guards quickly approaching from the porticos of the temple. He tried to depart through the crowd, but there were too many people and he could not get past them. The guards caught up to him and seized him. For the guards who had not seen Jacob often themselves, he appeared to them to be similar to Yochanan, but they were not sure. The people stood almost silent as the guards bound Jacob and began to lead him away. Disperse now, the guard commander bellowed to the crowd. Anyone who does not depart will face incarceration. He then motioned to the detail holding Jacob to return up the steps to Caiaphas. As Jacob was led away, the people began descending the steps and returning to their other affairs. Many could be seen looking back as they talked in hushed tones to each other over the events that had just transpired. What did he do? One man said to another, who simply shrugged his shoulders, not knowing himself. He spoke nothing unlawful. All he did is speak of Hashem in our hearts, said another who was walking with his wife. Is it now unlawful to discuss our religion in public? Asked another, who then turned around and shook his fist at the guards. Have the Romans and Herodians decided that we no longer may listen to any other than themselves? As the people continued on their way, the guards took Jacob to Caiaphas. Your Holiness, the guard commander said as he entered the high priest's chambers. Caiaphas motioned for him to enter. We have the man in custody. He nearly escaped and we had a minor disturbance with the crowd. Yes, no doubt, Caiaphas responded, placing his clenched fist on the table. I will never again permit this conduct in Jerusalem. I will punish anyone who tries, including the immerser. Bring him to me. The guard commander motioned to his assistant in the doorway, and the detail entered with Jacob in bonds, somewhat disheveled from the treatment he had received. Caiaphas had still not looked at him. Yochanan, so we see each other again, he said as he looked around to the rear of his seat to adjust the vase, taking time to control his visible distaste for Yochanan. How is it that Herod allowed you to leave? Yochanan is not here, Jacob answered. My name is Jacob. Caiaphas spun around, knocking to the floor the vase he had been handling. The shattering of the vessel echoed through the room. Jacob! He raised his voice in volume as he said Jacob's name. He looked at Jacob and motioned for the guards to bring him closer. And a scene for real, and not Yochanan? Caiaphas paused to think the situation through. What was your business on the temple steps? Preaching, Jacob responded. Preaching what? Caiaphas demanded. That the people need to approach Hashem with their hearts, not just in the outward ordinance of the Torah. Jacob was almost preaching to Caiaphas. Were there any witnesses? The high priest questioned his guard commander. None that we detained, Your Holiness, the commander said. Caiaphas was feeling somewhat foolish. Seizing an Essene preacher, an unarmed man and one dressed in white linen, was not going to look good to the people or to the Romans. Should he thought, accuse him of some crime even without a witness? No, that may not be a good idea in this case. It was probably better just to give him a warning and let him go. Jacob, you say, Caiaphas began, and Jacob nodded affirmatively. Not this Yeshua we have heard so much about? Jacob shook his head side to side in the negative. Caiaphas continued, I warn you not to gather the people into such crowds. These are dangerous days, and such gatherings are cause for concern. If you follow my instructions, there is no difficulty, and I can let you go. Jacob had kept his head and did not rail against Caiaphas, even though he wanted to do so. There was no intention on my part to cause any grief to the high priest or the orderliness of the house of the Lord, responded Jacob. Very well, you are free to go, Caiaphas motioned to the guards to remove the bonds and escort him out. As he departed the high priest's chambers in the temple, Jacob was silently praying to Hashem, thanking him for deliverance. He had never actually suffered such an event. The closest he had ever come to being captured was when he and Jude had incited crowds to riot against the tax of Caesar many years before. He had spent most of his time in Damascus. Maybe he was not cut out for the type of exposure Yochanan was capable of managing. Caiaphas was shaken. The mere thought of Yochanan unsettled him. The Essene had showed no disrespect, but something just did not seem right. Maybe he had erred in releasing him without more questioning. No, what was done, but he was sure that the movement of the resistance was again gaining momentum. Pilate was in Jerusalem, and Caiaphas decided that he needed to meet with him and Herod's vizier. The men met the next morning. They agreed on a plot where Pilate would announce a new plan of bringing Caesar's effigies to place around the city and the temple to incite resistance. Once a disturbance started, Pilate would then obliterate the demonstrators and the members of the resistance with them. During the discussion, a Roman soldier delivered a message to them concerning a suspected messianist seen preaching in Galilee, who was causing a problem over the tax. Pilate had had enough and sent word to prepare for a crackdown. He wanted Yochanan secretly moved to Machaerus in preparation for his plan to totally abolish Jewish laws and have a stranglehold on Jerusalem. Caiaphas cautioned him against any action that could not be justified to the people and to Caesar. Pilate scoffed at him, realizing that the high priest was really only concerned about his own position and feared to endanger his lifestyle or position of prestige. Pilate rejected his arguments and returned to Caesarea, where he ordered reinforcements from Caesarea to Antonia fortress in Jerusalem in preparation for the bloodbath. The army reinforcements arrived in Jerusalem at night with Caesar's effigy on their ensigns, and they began to erect images and statues in prominent places, including the temple. The next day, the people saw this deliberate violation of their sacred laws and started to join in small clusters of demonstrations against this desecration of their religion and holy sites. Caiaphas watched all this with some trepidation and, fearing a major confrontation, reneged somewhat on his idea to be so forceful once the reality and danger of the situation dawned on him. He again concerned himself about Caesar's reaction and sent word to Pilate that there may be a better way. Pilate was too far on the path to retract his position. The setting was ripe for the flaming of a general rebellion that would allow him to reap glory. Joseph's followers and many people in Galilee, including those watching for Yochanan and Tiberius, heard the news of the images in Jerusalem and went to Caesarea to protest their arrival in Jerusalem. Joseph, however, decided to stay in Galilee to ensure that he could respond if needed. The crowd's numbers surged as they arrived in Jerusalem and Caesarea to protest against Pilate. In Caesarea, Pilate refused to grant the people their ancient laws against the statues and ensigns, so many fell to the ground and refused to move. The crowd continued to lay prostrate for the next 5 days to protest Pilate's actions in Jerusalem. During this time, Yochanan heard from Herod that he was moving him to another location. To conceal their intentions, Caiaphas and Pilate had demanded of Herod that Yochanan have no more contact with any of his followers. Herod had to accomplish the move in secrecy and would use the events in Jerusalem to his advantage. He arranged for the movement a day after the last visit Yochanan would ever receive. The actual transfer would begin at the time Yochanan usually took his walk and his view from the wall. As more of the people heard about the events concerning the images in Jerusalem, many left the area to go to Jerusalem to protest or to Caesarea. At that point, Herod had a man similar in appearance to Yochanan dress in his clothes and walk the usual areas and then appear for a short time on the wall. During this diversion, Herod had Yochanan bound and gagged and placed in a box that concealed him from view and prevented his escape. With a small group of Herodian guards and Romans dressed as mere merchants, they took Yochanan from Tiberias. Once they were several furlongs from the palace and out of view of possible spies, they were joined by a century of Romans for security, and they took Yochanan to Herod's palace fortress at Machaerus on the east side of the Dead Sea. Herod planned to depart from Machaerus as well after the operations were completed. The subterfuge of the man who appeared to be Yochanan walking in the palace area at Tiberias continued for many days. Although he was deeply resentful of the accusations Yochanan made publicly against him and his establishment, Herod was more afraid of what would happen when the people did not see the immerser any longer. Herod knew the people respected the Essene, and in his own mind and heart, Herod did as well. It was not hard for him to envision a general uprising once Yochanan disappeared altogether. So, Herod requested further assistance from the Roman commander and Pilate to ensure his own safety after Yochanan's transfer. They saw the opportunity as well as the dangers and agreed to fortify Herod's guards and the Roman sentry at Tiberias with a Roman cohort for the express purpose of putting down any uprisings over the affair. The agreement was that the cohort would camp several miles to the northwest to best use an element of surprise. More support could come from Caesarea as needed. If Pilate had his way, he would now be able to justify a massive bloodshed under the guise of a civil disorder in at least 3 places, possibly even forcing the resistance to fight him in the open. Things were falling into place. The people in Jerusalem already upset about the effigies and statues of Caesar, the protests to him in Caesarea also regarding the effigies in Jerusalem, and now the disappearance of Yochanan that would fan the flames in Galilee. In Jerusalem, the whole city was now in a riot over the statues and effigies. The crowds, many led by followers of Jude and accompanied by people from the countryside, protested the actions of the procurator and the Herodians and Jews who collaborated with him. Jude himself went to Caesarea to lead the protests there. In Caesarea, the crowds continued to gather, and Pilate felt the moment had come. He called them to the open marketplace, telling them he would give them an answer to their protests and demands. His plan was to kill them all, using soldiers in civilian clothing with concealed weapons and regular soldiers who would encircle the crowds and fall upon them. Pilate believed the people were where he wanted them, and that his soldiers could easily dispatch many of the resistors. His soldiers in disguise and large reserves of troops were ready to attack and kill all who protested his desires. The plan should unfold equally in Caesarea and in Jerusalem. But as Jude watched the developments, he realized it was a trap. He saw Pilate move toward one of his officers, and he could tell that Pilate was coordinating some kind of plan. Jude watched closely as Pilate gave an order to his soldiers to surround the Jews with their weapons. The soldiers rushed to comply and encircled the crowd in 3 ranks. Once the soldiers were in place, Pilate told the crowd that he was going to have the soldiers cut them in pieces and ordered the soldiers to draw their weapons. If the people did not immediately disperse, he would put them all to immediate death. Jude, now as his alias Yeshua, was certain of the planned slaughter and entered the fray to tell the rioters to lie down and say they would rather suffer death than permit the violation of Torah. "He who obeys Torah need not fear the law of Caesar this day," he yelled as loud as he could. "Obey Torah and sacrifice your lives for Hashem, and let Hashem take care of Caesar," Yeshua pleaded. The people scolded him, but as his warnings became more desperate, the people started to respond to him. They began to lie down, baring their necks while asking for death rather than desecration of their religion. Yeshua saw it as the only way to prevent a slaughter, as the signs of military activity were now plainly taking place with soldiers also moving down several of the side streets. Pilate could not believe what he saw. The entire crowd was prostrate on the ground demanding death rather than desecration. "What is this?" Pilate seethed, pacing back and forth, growling under his breath. "I cannot believe what I am seeing. These are the great warriors of Judea? They will not even stand up and die as men. They are pathetic creatures, these Jews." He looked over at his commanders and shook his head again, clenching his fists and gritting his teeth. He then looked away and back at the crowd. "Caesar will have my head if he hears I massacred unarmed civilians lying on the ground. Certainly word of this would reach him, and nothing I can do will stop it. He will see this action by the people as an act of submission and a pleading for their religion." He could not help but talk to himself, and he shook his head in disappointment. "Your Excellency," the Roman commander said, "I did not hear what you directed." "Nothing," said Pilate. "I suppose if they feel this strongly about it, even Caesar would give it to them. He would consider killing them a travesty of justice." With a violent wave of his arm, Pilate had the soldiers withdraw. "People of Galilee and Judea," he could barely force the words from his mouth, "I will respect your wishes and will remove these images so offensive to you." Secretly, he hoped that the other portions of his plan unfolding in Galilee and Jerusalem would have better results. As Pilate gave his new directions and informed the crowds that he would carry the effigies and ensigns out of Jerusalem, Yeshua and the people were ecstatic, believing that Hashem was fighting for them. A battle had been won, and without the loss of blood of a single Jew. But Jude was concerned about what the situation may be in Jerusalem. Fortunately, once he arrived back in Jerusalem, he found that cool heads had prevailed there as well. But Pilate was not done. There was still Tiberius. His only problem, he realized, was that he had spread his forces thinly. Hopefully, Tiberius would be an easy operation and catch the resistance totally by surprise, since the disturbance in Jerusalem acted as a diversion. In the meantime, Joseph was having his followers watch for Yochanan at the Herodian palace in Tiberias, when one day they did not see him. The teacher was not walking at the appointed time, and he made no appearances at any other. Simultaneously, Joseph also received word that Pilate had backed down and removed the statues and effigies. The timing of the events caused Joseph to fear the worst and instructed 2 of his men to visit Yochanan. As Joseph had anticipated, the guards refused the visit. Joseph was now sure that something was wrong, and he sent messages to his allies in Damascus that he thought Yochanan was dead or that Herod had moved him. Word spread quickly that Yochanan was missing, and the people began to protest all across the country in larger and larger groups. As a result, Herod became concerned that the forces he had available to him were not sufficient, and he sent runners to Caesarea that he needed assistance. With the news of the dispatch of the additional Romans from Caesarea, the people's anger brought them to large demonstrations outside the palace. "Where is Yochanan?" cried the crowd as they saw Herod walking along the wall of his palace so he could view the disturbances. "Down with Herod and Caesar," the crowd began to chant. "You take our bread, take the fruit of our labors, and then take our spiritual leaders," cried men from various locations in the crowd. "What is this that you do?" Joseph's agents were amongst the crowd, trying to determine if and when Herod may strike. They kept Joseph informed of the developments through a system of messenger runners, while Joseph set up alternate headquarters closer to Tiberias. He knew he would need to interdict any reinforcements coming from Caesarea, at least cutting off the supply lines so that his forces could protect the people from wholesale slaughter. There was no time to gather a large force to repel the Romans, and it was unlikely to succeed anyway. It would merely cause a Roman response to indiscriminately attack across the Galilee, a possibility that may happen even as a result of a small uprising. But there was little anyone could do to stop the gathering storm. He was certain it was a plan of Pilate's from the beginning to try and force the resistance to respond in a large-scale open battle, so that the superior forces of the Romans could destroy them. But he could not stop the people from their anger. While he was well respected, the disappearance of Yochanan was not something he could placate nor accept. He also sent runners to other resistance leaders, including those in Jerusalem and Damascus, so that they could prepare for any eventuality. He then began directing his fighters to the most important locations and tasks. "We have no choice but to attack the Romans as they enter Tiberias, which they surely will do. But we also need to attack the reinforcements and supply lines that proceed from Caesarea," he told Eleazar and his other leaders. "Eleazar, you take the 1st and 2nd company and set up in the hills to the west. Attack the columns of the Romans from the rear and engage them in delaying tactics to slow their advance. The 3rd and 4th companies will remain with me. We will need to engage any attack." Eleazar gathered his forces and planned to move quickly the rest of the day and during the night up to the hills west of Tiberias on the way to Caesarea. He moved with haste because he was afraid he was already too late to slow the Roman advance. Iosas looked at the terrain north of Tiberias and knew he could not meet a large Roman army unit on open ground. He decided that he needed to conduct a delaying action at the town's borders to inflict the most casualties against the Romans and allow the people to flee their homes. It was the best he could hope for. He also continued to try and communicate the dangers of the demonstration to those so engaged, but it was fruitless. On the afternoon of the second day of the demonstrations, the gates of the palace suddenly opened, and a horde of soldiers attacked the crowd with swords, arrows, spears, and slings. Many of the people close to the gates were killed outright. The crowd began to disperse, but a small group of armed men confronted the soldiers and began to engage them in battle. Iosas received word of the fighting and proceeded to a small hill where he could watch the action and prepare his fighters should it be necessary. As he watched from the hill, he looked to his left and saw a Roman cohort attacking from the north of the valley, traversing the distance to the palace quickly, even though they remained in formation. It was obvious that the attack from the palace and the advance of the cohort was a coordinated maneuver. He knew he had only a short time to act. As the soldiers from the palace slew many who tried to flee from them or fight them, more armed men from Galilee entered into the battle. But they were not in a position to know that they were being trapped. There was nothing Iosas could do but to try and stay the slaughter. He had placed his men in their positions on the north side of the town during the night, and they waited for his commands. They took additional precautions to evacuate the people of the area just before dawn to prevent them from being injured or killed. As the Romans closed the distance between themselves and the outskirts of the town, Iosas used a cloth to signal to his commander that the attack by the Romans from the north had begun. As the Romans approached the edge of the town, the resistance unleashed a barrage of arrows, felling a number of the Roman soldiers on the front line. The Romans would have formed a phalanx at such an event in other circumstances, but the Roman commander, surprised by the attack, had the soldiers rush the city. As the first Romans ran through the area of small homes at the outskirts of town, the Zealots met them with a fury. Outnumbered, but having the element of surprise, the Zealots were able to inflict heavy casualties on the Romans. The fight was one of lightning-quick attacks, followed by retreats to a staging point, and then new attacks in a different location. The movements of the action confused the Romans, who did not know the next direction of an assault. In the meantime, archers on housetops and in concealed positions picked off various individual Romans, further disorienting them and preventing their advance. Iosas, with his smaller force, hurried to the area of the palace where his fighters attacked the Herodian guards and the members of the Roman century, who were now in a pitched battle with armed Galileans. With Iosas and his force joined against the Romans, the unarmed demonstrators were now able to flee the area. The increase in the force against the Herodians and Romans was sufficient to force them to retreat back to the palace. Iosas considered storming the edifice, but was not sure what he may find inside. He held back his men far enough to avoid the archers on the palace walls and allowed the palace gates to close. He then ordered his men, and any of the Galileans with him who were willing, to assist in the attack on the Roman cohort north of the palace. He left a few spies and a runner to ensure that Herod sent no new troops from the palace into his rear. To the west, Eleazar was watching as a Roman column moved through the hills. He had already found in silence many of the Roman forces' flank scouts and was preparing to attack the supply line at the end of the column. He estimated that the force was at least a cohort, maybe more. The Roman advance guard, now about 2 furlongs ahead and to the east of the main column, was under attack by Eleazar's men. As the main column moved forward to engage the battle, the supply line was left mostly unprotected. At the opportune moment, Eleazar ordered the attack to destroy the stocks and supplies. His men leaped out of their places of concealment and fell upon the few Roman soldiers who were left to guard the equipment and stores. Eleazar's men easily dispatched them, and then proceeded to burn the supplies that they could not take with them. They were mostly concerned about obtaining weapons and battle supplies that could assist in smaller guerrilla operations. With the supply train quickly sacked, their attention turned to attacking the rear of the Roman column that was now in a choke point in the hills because of the ambush of the advance guard. The Romans had lost many of their men and were trying to array in battle formations suitable for the train, but they were surrounded and unable to maneuver effectively. It was then that Eleazar and his men arrived to attack the west of the column and engage them in a major battle. Losses were now heavy on both sides, but the Romans were obviously working to return to Caesarea. As Eleazar doubted he would gain any great deal, even if he could annihilate the Roman force, he was more concerned about additional Roman units that could arrive in the area. He moved his line to allow the Romans to retreat west and disengage his forces. The surviving Romans took the opportunity and fled back towards Caesarea. As Iosas now joined the fight on the north side of Tiberias, Men of the town and other locals who had been watching the fighting took up weapons and also attacked the Romans. It was obvious the Romans had no idea that they would be involved in fighting prior to their arrival near the palace. While their skill and equipment far surpassed the Zealots and their allies, the Romans could not regain the initiative in the battle that they sought. They began a piecemeal retreat out of Tiberias and north to their encampment. However, several Roman soldiers saw Iosas as he disengaged from the fighting and took a position near some brick buildings to evaluate the overall conditions of his forces and the actions of the Romans and Herodians. Two of the Romans who saw him thought him to be the same man who may be the leader of the Sicarii, but were certain he was at least the commander of the present action because of his manner of controlling the revolutionaries. They saw that Iosas was separated from his main group and decided that they had an opportunity to seize him or kill him. "Is not he the man we suspect as the leader of the Sicarii?" said the leader, almost too surprised to know what to do. "Yes, I am certain of it." He looked around and assessed the situation and resources. "Yes, we must capture this one. Think of the honor and the rewards. Come on, let's do this." Gathering several more Romans to assist them in their design, they went after Iosas and the men who were with him. Since he was separated from the main fighting as he was examining a portion of the battlefield, the Romans overwhelmed his small team. The Zealots, realizing their predicament and the danger to Iosas, fought all the more fiercely. Iosas himself was forced to engage several Romans with a sword, easily slaying two of them and wounding a third. However, the Romans killed two of Iosas' men and wounded another. Finally, Iosas was able to clear an avenue of escape, and he and those remaining with him ran deeper into the town with the Romans in pursuit. As usual, the Zealots split up as they ran away, causing some confusion for the pursuing legionnaires. The Romans managed to identify Iosas, however, and the main group continued to pursue him, but he slipped away from them due to his familiarity with the town and its terrain. Concerned for their own lives as they were now separated from the main body of Roman troops and disappointed at their failure, the Romans fled to the palace for safety, and the Herodian guards allowed them entrance. Upon reaching the safety of the palace, they reported their sighting to Herod Antipas, who became incensed. Here they had a perfect opportunity to confront the Zealots and destroy them, and Pilate and the garrison of Caesarea had botched it. While Antipas had feared angering the populace with the disappearance of Iokannan, Pilate and the Roman commanders had assured him that the troublemakers would be destroyed. He now realized that the Romans had not taken the situation seriously enough to provide the proper strength of forces. Instead, their weak, triple-pronged approach had been a disaster, a separation of forces easily defeated by the resistance. He now feared that without additional help, the palace might be besieged and destroyed. But the word from the walls of the palace was that the crowds had dissipated and the fighting had apparently left the city. Things were calming down. Herod decided to hold his defenses and wait. He was confident that the Romans from Caesarea would arrive soon, but he did not yet know that Eleazar had stopped them as well. His disappointments were about to increase. Iosas' forces began to reassemble near the edge of the town. He knew he had to speak to them and allow them to begin their departure from the area and return to their homes. Despite the victory, Roman retribution would come at any moment, and Iosas knew he did not have the forces necessary to defeat a legion or more. He also realized he may never see Iokannan again. He sent word to Jude and Jacob concerning his efforts, his successes, and his failures to free Iokannan. Pilate was still not done. He ordered the leaders of the rebellion in Tiberias must be found and crucified. A legion was sent, as Iosas feared, to Tiberias, and many hundreds of men accused of being members of the resistance were arrested and crucified. Most of them were innocent, or were never proven to be revolutionaries by the Romans or the Herodian administrators. If anyone looked suspicious, or if they had been recognized as part of any disturbance, they were bound, beaten, and hung on a stake. Tiberias itself was mostly spared, but whole villages in the surrounding parts of Galilee were burned, their inhabitants killed, crucified, or sold into slavery. The soldiers who had seen Iosas and mistaken him for Jude reported what they saw to their superiors, who then had them looking once again for Iosas in particular, although they did not know exactly who he was. While some sorrow, grief, and anger engulfed the Galilee, Iosas pondered the results of his attempt to save the demonstrators from their own actions. As he watched the stakes and crosses mount on the land and those hanging from them suffering agonizing deaths, families being burned from their homes, and the general persecution of the populace, he could not help but feel alone and despondent. His mastery of the mysteries and his well-developed stoicism still could not prevent him from feeling the magnitude of the devastation. He retired with his family to Emmaus to meditate and come to grips with what he needed to do. Aggravated over his losses and embarrassment in Tiberias, Pilate decided on another ruse to get the resistance to take up arms on a more massive scale that he could confront militarily and with superior forces. He schemed with Caiaphas to take the sacred money from the temple treasury and use it to begin building an aqueduct with images on it from the hills to the city of Jerusalem. This plan went out publicly so as to stir up every citizen, down to the most tame and docile of the people. The matter was on everyone's lips, and all, even those normally supportive of the Romans, began to murmur against Pilate. First, this Roman placed idols of Caesar in our land and upon our temple, desecrating our holy places and defying our laws, one orator cried in Jerusalem, his speech gathering many of the people who shouted in agreement. He then removed them, thanks to Hashem, blessed be he, but has returned to do a greater profanity. He now takes the treasury of the temple, the offerings to Hashem, and uses them to build an idolatrous water duct for his own pleasure and to please Caesar, not Hashem. Yes, yes, those of the crowd yelled. Down with Pilate, down with Caesar, they all shouted. This was repeated throughout Judea and the Galilee. As construction of the aqueduct proceeded and the money from the sacred temple treasury was taken, the hue and cry elevated throughout the land. Jude, as Yeshua and Jacob, preached publicly against the actions of Pilate and the unwillingness of Caiaphas to refuse the Roman governor the sacred treasure. Even after long orations and written demands, Pilate refused to recant his position. It was obvious to Jude, Jacob, and even Joseph, who was in Emmaus, that Pilate wanted another excuse to justify a flow of blood. However, the people remembered the retributions in Galilee for the actions against the Romans and Herod over the disappearance of Yochanan. While they wanted to fight Pilate, they could not bear another bloodbath of their people. Redress to Caesar, perhaps, should work, they reasoned. But even with these actions, they saw Pilate was not going to back down. As a result, Jude decided that planned military and other drastic actions against the builders of the aqueduct and against the rich in the city who agreed to it were the only tools the people had left to them. Before launching his offensive, he went to Emmaus to discuss it with Joseph. The two brothers met in Eleazar's small house in Emmaus near the river Dismas. It was late in the evening, almost dark, with a slight but noticeable breeze from the west. Joseph had just completed a meditation, an instruction to a new initiate in the use of one of the 72 names of Hashem for obtaining an answer to a question of merit. Joseph did these instructions often, as he was now a master, having ascended the chambers through the workings of the Merkava, a special type of Hekkelot meditation. He introduced his disciple to his brother. Nehunya, this is my twin brother Jude. Joseph arose, as did his disciple, greeting Jude as he entered the modest home. Jude extended his hand to Nehunya, but not to Joseph. Nehunya, a particularly sensitive young man, could sense a distinct friction between the two brothers. It was not so evident from Joseph, but Jude's presence seemed disturbing. He thought he recognized him from somewhere, but Jude looked enough like Joseph that Nehunya dismissed the recollection as nothing more than his familiarity with Joseph. The blessings of Hashem be upon you, Nehunya, Jude said as they completed their handshake, and Jude moved to the corner of the room as Joseph motioned for him to relax. Joseph has become a great mystic here. I am sure he can teach you many things, said Jude, trying to take any notion from the conversation of his true purposes. He did not know the young man and merely figured that he was of no consequence. Nehunya was a star pupil, Joseph told Jude. He has completed much of his training for me. I suspect he will be a great master in his own right if he continues with his studies and devotion to Hashem. Israel needs the influence and guidance of those who seek the lights. Jude was slightly offended. Jude is what matters now, he said, trying to play down the concept of all Israel. Unlike Joseph, Jude was not interested in any but the people of Judah and her appendages. With the insights given down through our father David the king, we have kept many of the traditions alive, despite those who have forsaken them. Have you received this? He asked Nehunya, obviously in an attempt to see where Joseph had taken him. Joseph did not interrupt, but let Nehunya answer for himself. I receive whatever Hashem sees fit to bestow upon me, Nehunya responded. May my teacher allow me to depart? He asked Joseph. By all means, answered Joseph. As Nehunya left, Joseph turned to Jude. He is attentive to the plight of Jude and all Israel, Joseph began. It is likely he will become a great mystical master, and he understands the goals and purposes of the movement, Joseph continued. He is well known to Rabbi Zakkai, but has kept his distance from any actual collaboration with the Ketim or the Goyim. At the present time, he is my strongest disciple in the Hekkelot, Joseph concluded. You know your situation best, Jude shrugged. Will he take a position in your new order? Joseph shook his head. My intention is not to totally separate from Damascus. You should know that. Our brother Jacob is coming to understand my point of view and concedes on these points. The issue is not allowing the men of Israel to fall into ignorance. We must raise all those who show a capability, not just those who desire to have their daily routine mapped out for them from morning to night. Hashem wants us to meet the mark, not fall short of it or go beyond it. Joseph was trying his best not to inflame the conversation, but he knew he needed to show his resolve. Jude grew impatient. My purpose here is to discuss with you the fact that Pilate is going ahead with his plan of robbing the korban, which is the sacred money, of the temple, and using it for his water duct and its idols. There is nothing that can be done to stop him short of attacks to halt the progress of the work, as he habitually meets the demonstrations with violence. Again, in 2 days, 10,000 of our people will descend on Jerusalem to partake in another protest. We have reason to believe it may turn bloody. Jude, every time we take an action, even a defensive one, the Romans seize, kill, crucify, or sell into slavery hundreds, sometimes thousands of our people. What brought me here was the revenge that exacted against the people of Galilee after our defense of the demonstrators in Tiberias. Even if the Romans planned the whole thing as a slaughter, fewer would have died if the resistance had not become involved. Pilate is baiting us. He is nothing more than a butcher. These piecemeal actions are not providing us with victory, not even maintaining our position. Without a concerted diplomatic and military plan, our efforts are doomed. Joseph was not afraid of a fight. He had come to realize that if things were to be done right, a new strategy was necessary. See, it is obvious, retorted Jude. You have no desire to put your trust wholly in Hashem and do the works which will free our people. You are no different today than you were as a young boy, always running off to find something else. Joseph reached over and held his brother's right arm, looking straight into his eyes. Hashem has revealed to me during my meditative ascensions that the temple in Jerusalem is of little consequence, defiled and unsalvageable. We do the outward ordinances, but it is a shell. Hashem is no longer there. When Hashem's house is desecrated, Hashem destroys it. Likewise, our people are polluted. Their worship has not brought them as a people to the requisite consciousness. Have you not read that Hashem is sick of the blood of the sacrifice? Why? Because they have used it as an idol, worshiping the house and its ordinances and not Hashem. Without leaving the works undone, they should also seek to elevate their wisdom and understanding so that they come to a knowledge of Hashem, to beautify their souls with righteousness and mercy. Their works do not bring about a change in their hearts because they refuse to search the soul of the Torah. Do not lecture me on the mysticism of our fathers, Jude interrupted. Your reference to the tree of life is not the issue here. Surely the outward commandments and ordinances are to bring our people to a point where they can obtain a higher level, but what I am discussing here is the theft by this Roman of our strength and our sacrifices to Hashem. Surely that is as much an issue as the resurrection of ancient understandings. If not, how can we survive as a distinct people? Herodians were forced to convert to our religion by our former leaders, the Hasmoneans. Do you not remember that Hashem visits the iniquity of the fathers to the third and fourth generation? Our people as a whole approved and supported Jonathan the king in this wicked endeavor, and now our people suffer because of it. We brought it upon ourselves, and only a rectification will turn it around. Joseph reasoned with his brother. The temple is a Herodian edifice. It is not Hashem's. He will need to be written upon the hearts of the people and in Shiloh. Jude stood and shook his garments. Are you willing to lend your forces to our cause or not? Asked Jude. Joseph shook his head, saying, My path Hashem has shown to me. The righteous must show the way and bring all creation along with him or die trying. Shedding the blood of more men will not bring peace. It will bring more destruction. Battle is justified against the Katim and the collaborators, but that is not the wisest path, and it is not for me right now. Hashem will show me what we should do if you can remain patient and meditate on the chambers. Then we are through, Jude said conclusively. The council will be informed, and we will honor Hashem and defend Judah, the people, and the temple. Hashem has shown me the end of your path you now take, Jude, responded Joseph as he stood. What you have proposed shall end in the destruction of many of our people, the end of Judah, and the destruction of the temple. Jude looked at Joseph in disgust and left the house. Joseph immediately sat down and began a meditation. As he walked quickly to resume the companionship of his followers, Jude saw Miriam, the wife of Joseph, standing amongst some men and women not far from the home where Jude had left Joseph moments before. It appeared to Jude that Miriam was engaged in some type of instruction to the small group. His curiosity overcame him, and he moved closer to listen. Hashem desires that all of us, men and women, seek him out. Search for Hashem in your hearts and minds, for he is in you, and you are in him. Become temples of his spirit. Meditate upon the name, the Ruach HaKodesh, will be a reward, and then you can go further into his kingdom, she was saying to the group as they sat beneath a fig tree. Just then she noticed Jude. She excused herself and approached her brother-in-law. No disturbance was intended to you, Miriam, Jude remarked as she came closer to him, standing the obligatory arm's length away. It is not common to have a woman addressing a group like this, and you seem to be expounding upon the mysteries. My husband is my teacher, and he instructs me to instruct others as the Ruach HaKodesh moves me. Principally, however, my children are my responsibility. As I teach my children, sometimes the local people hear the instruction and wish to take part. Such was the case this evening. These remained after Martha helped the children to settle for the night, Miriam explained. How was your visit with my husband, she asked. It is not really my place to complain to a man's wife concerning him, Jude was matter of fact. You know our predicament, and you know that Joseph' claims are of no concern to me. However, he has strong alliances, and these could be important for the good of Judea. Miriam had no intention of second-guessing her husband. Joseph is my king, she responded, even if others do not accept him. As she spoke to Jude, she noticed two men go through the front door of the home where Joseph and Jude had just met. She looked back at Jude, who nodded his head affirmatively to her answer and excused himself. He walked slowly at first, and then gained speed in his stride as he returned to his companions and headed back east towards Jerusalem. Miriam quietly walked to the door of the house where Joseph and Jude had met and looked cautiously into the main room to see if she could recognize the visitors. She saw no one but Joseph, who was still in meditation, his head moving in rhythm to some particular words he was uttering. She knew not to disturb him, but as she turned to walk away, she heard him call to her. "Miriam," he uttered softly, "return for a moment." Her heart lightened at the mere thought of remaining in his presence. She entered the room and followed his gesture to sit down and join him. They sat quietly for a few moments, not speaking but looking at each other. Then he spoke again to her. "Of all who are with me," he began, "you are not only my wife, but the most gifted and important of all my disciples. Indeed, we are one, Beshert and Besherta. To you will Hashem place the burden of our children, Martha assisting you, and the carrying away of the kingdom into another land. However, Martha is the other half of the life, and we will need her here for my ascension to the next chamber." Miriam was stunned, unsure of the words she was hearing from Joseph, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. "My ascensions have brought me to a place where you both must join me so that we may proceed further. Go and return with Martha." Miriam arose and hurried several homes away to where Martha was sitting quietly weaving a small blanket. "Joseph calls for both of us," Miriam said in quiet tones. The younger children were fast asleep, but the oldest were sitting close by. "Yochanan, watch for me," was all Martha had to say to her son. She then placed her weaving materials on the floor and followed her sister Miriam to the other house. "Come, follow me to the upper room," Joseph said to them as they entered the house. He stood and helped the women to the stairwell. They climbed the stairs together on the east side of the house. As they entered the upper room where Joseph kept his most sacred items, Miriam saw Nehunya and another man in the corner of the room in the shadows. The man, she finally recognized, was one of the priests from On. Joseph motioned for them, and they all descended the stairs to a small room on the first floor with a mikveh constructed so that fresh water constantly supplied by the Dismas River passed through it, which had been prepared for Joseph. The priest from On spread ashes from a red heifer in the water as he recited a prayer. Joseph then entered the water and immersed himself in it while he said several more prayers. Thus purified, he came out of the water and dressed in white linen robes. The group then ascended the stairs back to the upper room. Joseph closed the door, and separated them from the outside world. "Over the past several weeks, Hashem has helped me through the chambers, and now I await entrance to the seventh. Tonight Hashem will bring me near to his presence, for you are my Besherta," he said, gesturing to Miriam, a likeness of Hashem's Shekinah. And you, my dear Martha, he said, gesturing to her, complete the mirror of his image which we are, and the guardians await my arrival in the upper chambers. Stand one step to my right side, Miriam, and Martha to her right. Both of you hold each other's right hand. Soon I will descend into the Merkava, and then ascend to the angels guarding the supernal chambers, going through the chambers until I finally reach the seventh and highest. Miriam's body was trembling at the sound of his words, and she could feel the immensity of the event unfolding before her, even in these humble surroundings. Joseph nodded at Nehunya, who then placed his prayer shawl or tallit over his head. She watched as Joseph stood and placed his tallit over his head to create a tent similar to a portable tabernacle. She moved closer to his right side as he had instructed, and Martha then moved next to her right side. The women covered their heads with tallits, and each held the other's right hand. Joseph began with a short prayer of thanks to their Creator. The priest of On said nothing. He was there merely to ensure that Joseph entered the Merkava vision and that his spirit was still able to remain with his body after entering near to the divine presence. Then Joseph began repeating the divine names. So we'll start with chapter 9 next time. As you can see, this is getting pretty intense. These are deep, deep meditations that you're going to hear Joseph go through. And I've talked about the Heckalot very often, and that's what Jesus meant in the New Testament when he said, in my Father's house are many mansions. Mansions are the Heckalot. He's going through those up to the seventh mansion or seventh chamber. So next time we'll be on chapter 9 out here.